Hello and welcome. These audio recordings are designed for students sitting the CIE IGCSE History exam. And today we will go over one of the more common Part C questions found on Paper 1. Paper 1 is worth 40% of your overall IGCSE grade, and you will be asked to answer 3 ABC style questions, 2 from Section A and 1 from Section B on your depth study. You might find it useful to have a pen and paper to hand, but it's okay if you just want to listen through as part of your revision. Today we will be looking at a question which focuses on the Vietnam War and which you will have studied as part of the Cold War. Why did the USA withdraw from the Vietnam War? Now, be aware that Part C questions are worth 12 marks and invariably will have a statement followed by the question, how far do you agree? So this question may come up in the form of Viet Cong tactics were the main reason for American withdrawal from Vietnam, how far do you agree? Or growing domestic protest was the main reason for withdrawal from the Vietnam War, how far do you agree? But for the purposes of being thorough, this question is just going to tackle it from a generic point of view. Why did the USA withdraw from the Vietnam War? Many of you will be familiar with what us history teachers call the PEE method. That is to say, in each paragraph you make a clear point, that's the P, back it up with evidence in the form of dates, names, statistics, quotations, people, places and events, that's the second E, and then explain, which is the third E. Phrases such as this shows or this suggests are helpful in achieving this, and better answers will often give more than one layer of explanation. We call this PEE 2.0 because you're doing it twice. So in this response we will use the PEE formula and we will offer a 5-point scope. Okay, let's get started. Why did the USA withdraw from the Vietnam War? Point 1. Tactics of the Viet Cong. Evidence to support this include American technology was far superior, but they could not score an easy victory over the Viet Cong. There were 170,000 VC or Viet Cong soldiers in 1965, and they were being supplied with equipment from China and the USSR. After an American victory in La Drang Valley in December 1965, in which 2,000 VC were killed to only 300 American and South Vietnam troops, the VC increasingly began to use guerrilla tactics, and they were led by a former teacher and highly skilled soldier, Ho Chi Minh. The VC constructed 240 kilometers of tunnels, such as the famous Cu Chi tunnels. They wore no uniform, and American soldiers often found it difficult to identify them from South Vietnamese. The VC used hugging the belt tactics, which is where they would stay as close as possible to American troops before opening fire and then dispersing, so the Americans often felt like they were fighting shadows. The VC laid booby traps, such as punji traps, which were basically pits filled with spikes, and they were ruthless. 27,000 civilians were killed for aiding America and the South. Our final piece of evidence to support this point is in the form of the Tet Offensive of 1968. This was a real turning point in the war, and the VC attacked over 100 targets simultaneously, and it was often perceived as a media victory, if not a military victory. So in explaining our first point, you may wish to argue that one of the reasons America withdrew is because of the VC tactics and the fact that this was not an easy war. Point 2. Growing domestic protest. Evidence to support this includes JFK had sent the first troops to Vietnam in 1961, but under President Johnson, this had increased to over 500,000, and it wasn't until Nixon that it was significantly reduced with the notion of peace with honor, and by 1974, there were no American troops left in Vietnam. The war had been costing $20 billion a year, and because of these two factors, there was an increasing student protest. Events such as Woodstock featured Country Joe, who sang "What Are We Fighting For?" There was changing technology at home, and a VC suspect was shot dead live on US TV by the Saigon Chief of Police in February 1968, which really brought home the reality of war to Americans in their suburban homes. And so in explaining this point, you may wish to argue that America had lost a significant amount of domestic support, and that this was one reason why they withdrew from the Vietnam War. Point 3. Nature and makeup of American soldiers. Now, you have to be sensitive when explaining this point. There were many committed soldiers from America in Vietnam, but evidence to support this point might include the average age. There's an erroneous song which pinpoints the average age of American soldiers as 19, but in fact it was more like 23. Many of the soldiers were from poor backgrounds, and some did not understand fully why they were fighting. Michael Bilton, in his book 4 Hours in My Lai, explains that American recruits scored low on standardized intelligence tests. The Vietnamese troops, on the other hand, were defending their nation, and they were experienced in the terrain, the tactics, and the weather of fighting in Vietnam, having fought seasoned campaigns against both the French and the Japanese in recent years. And so in explaining point 3, you may wish to argue that the makeup and nature of American soldiers was one reason that they could not score an easy overall victory and ultimately withdrew from the Vietnam War. Point 4. Support from the Vietnamese population. Evidence to include this argument into your essay can be: support and materiel were provided on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. 40,000 people worked to keep this open. Even though the VC suffered higher losses than America, estimated at 1 million overall, they were fighting for their people, whereas the US were in a land far from home and morale was often low. There were draft dodgers, such as famously Muhammad Ali, who protested that this was not his war. So in explaining point 4, you may wish to link back to point 2 and say that, well, whilst there was growing domestic protest in America against this war, in Vietnam the local population were actually helping the VC soldiers, and that this was a reason for ultimate American withdrawal from Vietnam. Point 5. American military tactics. Now, we've already explained that American technology was far superior to that of the VC, and evidence to support this point might include Operation Rolling Thunder. These were extensive bombing raids launched in February 1965, especially on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But there were 14,000 US aircraft shot down, including famously Senator John McCain, who was kept at the Hanoi Hilton, and this was used for propaganda purposes by the VC. Secondly, General William Westmoreland's tactics of search and destroy missions, such as the civilian massacre in which 300 to 400 people were killed by Lieutenant William Calley and Charlie Company in My Lai in March 1968, known at the time as Pinksville, led to very negative news reporting. So too did the use of Agent Orange, and there was a famous photograph of 10-year-old Kim Phuc with no clothes on following a napalm attack. This did much to damage the American war effort. And so in explaining this point, you may wish to argue that failures within Operation Rolling Thunder, Search and Destroy, and the use of Agent Orange all contributed towards American withdrawal from the Vietnam War. So, why did the USA withdraw from the Vietnam War? We have given a 5-point argument. VC tactics, growing domestic protest, a lack of motivation from US soldiers, support from the Vietnamese population, and American military tactics. Okay, now it's time for a clever conclusion. An American lieutenant called Caputo in the Marine Corps recalls, quote, "We just couldn't see what could be done to defeat these people," unquote. There are many reasons, but Saigon fell on the 30th of April 1975, and by the 29th of March 1973, America had already left. This essay argues it was an unwinnable war in the first place, due to the very nature of fighting an ideology, not a person. Ideology creates martyrs. As one US soldier later described it, it was like, quote, "fighting shadows," unquote. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I hope you found this useful. If you did, feel free to follow me on Twitter at Mr. Guiney History, or you can subscribe to my YouTube channel for further pieces of advice. Bye bye.